Here we are in All Saints Parish Church, Bakewell, for another conversation with John Butler. John, you have a few fairly well-known sayings now. I'm just going to touch on one of them with you, explore it a bit more. I think it's one of your favourites. Don't fence me in. Just remind us where this came from.
Well, at the risk of boring you, because I'm sure I've told this story many times before, I was at school. It was my second school. I suppose I was about maybe 15 years old. We had little, what were called studies, really just a tiny little space where each of us had our things. And somehow I came across a picture of a cowboy riding up to the crest of a hill. And I loved cowboys at that time. I loved to read cowboy stories, and it was my dream to be a cowboy, really. And the caption to this picture was, "Don't fence me in." And even at that age, that seemed to just sum up what I longed for, sitting in that little boxed-in space with my school books. Yeah, even at that age, I yearned for the wide open spaces. Don't fence me in. A good horse underneath me and a wide horizon before.
Does that remind you of a song, John?
Oh, it does remind me of a song. Some years later, when I first heard that song, I fell in love with it, and I've loved it ever since.
And what song would that be?
Well, guess what? Don't fence me in. This is really, honestly, truly, seriously, quite apart from all the philosophy and spiritual stuff you've heard coming out of my mouth, I couldn't think of a better summary of my life than "Don't fence me in."
Well, you can look forward to your funeral, John, because I think you won't be surprised to learn that might be.
I think I have dropped a hint now and then that I'd like that played at my funeral.
I'm sure you'll appreciate it at the time. But there are two sort of threads I want to unpick, so to speak, with you this afternoon. So there's this hemmed-in schoolboy sent away to boarding school, but you grew up in the countryside, didn't you? You weren't fenced in up till the age of 7.
No, absolutely. No, I think that's why it came as a shock to me when I was, because I had a marvellous life of freedom as a child up to the age of 7. We lived in the deep country then, surrounded by fields. Yes, goodness, yes, silence and space were, and nature, of course. The green fields were my natural home.
Were you not fenced in by Mum and Dad saying, "Don't go there, don't go there"?
Well, it was during the war. Dad was away on war work for most of it. There was just Mother, my sister and I. My sister, older than me, had her own interests and friends, but so I was very much on my own, and well, there was nothing for Mum to be afraid of, or what harm could come to me in such a place, and so I was used to playing on my own, and I don't know that I played very much. I don't remember. Of course, I had a few farm animals, little toys and things at home, but when I went outside, I think I was just comfortable with whatever was there. The trees and hedges and plants and things. I must have spent many, many hours just absorbing the fields, I suppose.
And what was the first animal bond you can recall from the early years?
I think I managed to catch a lizard at one time, and I remember I built a little enclosure out of stones for it and instantly put the lizard, I remember he was called Bill, and I put this lizard in this little enclosure, I suppose a foot or two square, and innocently went into my tea or something, and when I came out, of course, guess what? The lizard was gone. That was one of my first lessons. And then I had mice and pet mice. I remember they multiplied exponentially, is it? And one day, Mum and Dad had to step in. So that was the mice, and then I had a rabbit, a lovely big rabbit in a wire sort of thing that was moved around on the lawn. But then one day the neighbour's dog came, and that was the end of rabbit. So I had early acquaintance with death and tragedy in my little life.
What was the name of the rabbit?
Flossie. I know all about tears. They started early.
Well, Bill the Lizard may have taken a leaf out of your book, John. Don't fence me in, he's off. Wasn't your big sister, didn't she fence you in like big sisters do, box your ears or whatever?
She didn't fence me in, but she was always a bit bossy, which I suppose is a sort of being fenced in, isn't it? Being told what to do by other people. Not many of us like it, do we? Almost nobody likes it, apart from one or two rather sheep-like people that like being told what to do, so they don't have to decide for themselves.
But then you were sent away to boarding school at age
7. Mm.
And were you, that must have been a bit of a shock. Were you told what to do when you went to boarding school?
Absolutely, we were, from morning to night, yes. Yes, it was a shock. To this day, I don't know really whether it was a good or bad thing. I suppose, like so much in life, a bit of both. But it was the accepted thing to do with boys whose fathers could afford it at that time, and considered the best upbringing a little boy could have. Women were, well, the idea was that women made little boys soft, and too much mothering wasn't good for them, and it was good to make them stand on their own feet. So I hardly knew what a woman was until at the age of 18 I came out of the system at the other end and started discovering.
Exploring beyond the fences, John, into the girls' side.
Well, exactly. I'm still exploring too. I don't think I've learned yet.
Before you left, at rugby, where you were from the age of 11, I think?
From 13 to 18, yes.
That was a very strongly competitive environment and very disciplined, I imagine. That must have been like being fenced in.
Well, I did my best to, well, there was no avoiding it, but I certainly avoided it as much as was possible, and therefore was branded a failure. While other boys had a whole string of what was called distinctions after their names, you can guess how many I had. Almost none. But I think I did have any.
You must have had at least one distinction for nature studies.
Well, that wasn't a subject then.
What was it like being fenced in at a very disciplined school? It must have driven you mad.
What was it like? Well, some boys, perhaps the majority, thrived on it. It was designed from generations of experience. It was a very well-established system, and it produced some very fine men. I mean, the walls were festooned with pictures of all the noble, politicians and statesmen and well-known soldiers, creative men. Half the bishops in the church seemed to come from that sort of school. It's extraordinary how society has changed in my lifetime. I don't take too kindly to people that are very critical of the old ways. I think in many ways they were very good. They served their purpose. Of course, you can find fault with them. Well, there are faults in every system, aren't there? There are plenty of faults in the system today. Whether we've got it any better today is, I think, very questionable. I rather opt out of these discussions and don't know, really. Yes, I think in many ways that sort of schooling led to me being more independent, having a more interesting life. I look on people now who went early into the church or into business or into one of the professions, and I say, thank God I didn't do that. They, of course, made money and have become established members of society, whereas I've always lived on the fringe and been a bit of a failure. A failure until this last year or two I find myself on the internet and suddenly the world's all around me. But I'm rather in favour of being a failure. I think the failures are often the more interesting people in life. And certainly the unhappy ones are often, I think, far more interesting than the happy ones. Yes.
Is that a general rule of thumb for the apprentice?
The spiritual apprentice.
Choose the miserable path. It's more interesting.
There's a lot to be said for it. I've often said the reason most people, don't go further along the path of spiritual development is that they're not sufficiently unhappy. Because if you're in any measure content with this world, you're not going to make much effort to transcend it, are you?
In a way, you were expressing your "don't fence me in" by, shall we say, debunking or opting out of the success ethos of the school you were at, with all of these politicians and bishops around.
There was another chap and I, and it was his idea really, but he came back from holidays one day and had in a way summarised what he did not want to be, which was what he called a boy. A typical school boy, which was into sport. Of course, this was the prime qualification of success at school, to be good at sport. There were different mannerisms and that. Always going around, with other boys and being a centre of attention. Anyway, he and I, we palled up and encouraged each other in this not being like anybody else cult, which actually it gave us some satisfaction at least.
Was it a club of two?
Club of two, yes.
The don't fence me in boys.
Pretty much. Or don't conform, that would be more like. Yes, conformity was what I think we kicked against. He wasn't such a don't fence me in as I was, but yes, we rebelled against the sort of stereotypical public school boy image. Yes, that's put it in a nutshell.
And yet from there, you went to the Guards in the army, and if you rebelled there, you'd be in big trouble. So how did that square with don't fence me and all the discipline of the army?
Well, the big attraction to that, of course, was horses. It was a cavalry I wanted to be in. You know, I just loved that, and yes, the only regiment that had a significant number of horses at that time was, of course, the Guards, the Horse Guards, the Life Guards I was in.
What do the Life Guards do? I associate lifeguards with a pair of Speedos and a surfboard on the beach.
Well, the Life Guard are the senior regiment in the British Army, and they were founded a long time ago to guard the life of the king. Of course, that's why they're called Life Guards. And when I joined, they were about half and half horses and armoured cars, the early armoured cars. And so I had a good training in both. Oh, I loved the riding course and cavalry movements in Windsor Park. That was all great fun. Bit of sword drill. Swords, yes, we had sabres and that then.
Did you do that Edinburgh tattoo thing with the gun carriage?
Yeah, I never actually did the ceremonial side because I was what was called a national serviceman. I was only in for 2 years, and it was those that signed on for longer that did the ceremonial work. But I had lots of opportunities to. I absolutely adored the trumpet every morning, sounding us out of bed, and the smell of manure and the clatter of hooves, and it was a young man's romantic ideas turned in wonderful. I loved it. Mm.
And then what did you do after you left the service and with all its discipline?
Then the cowboy came back, and I would have gone to Texas because I thought that's where cowboys came from, but we didn't know, old Dad didn't know anybody in Texas, but he did have a friend in Australia who offered to just receive me there. So I was very lucky. Dad was very generous to me. He put me on a ship, and off I went to Australia. And after a while, found what I longed for, which was on some of these great cattle stations in the outback, a horse and wide open space all around me.
Any fences?
Precious few. There's one wonderful place where I worked, and one of the other men had a good voice. He used to love to sing these cowboy songs, and one gorgeous early morning with the kookaburras in the gum trees. Pete, his name was, singing. Good fresh horse between my legs. I thought, John, your dream come true.
Absolutely, in your element. And where did you sleep when you were out on the?
Well, if we didn't come back in the evening, we slept outside, of course. No problem there. It was before sleeping bags were invented. Can you imagine that? All these brightly coloured sleeping bags weren't invented then. I don't think plastic was invented either. There was none of those things. The Australians, they had what was called swags. Everyone just had rolled their blankets up, and in a roll, and put your toothbrush or whatever you wanted else with you in the middle of your blankets with a couple of bits of string to tie it together at each end and slung it over your back, and That was your swag. You probably heard the song, Once a Jolly Swagman. Well, a swagman was a man who carried his bed on his back like that. That's where it comes from, yes. Yes, I had a lovely swag. I used it for many, many years. You know, many, many adventures around the world. Yes, I had a canvas sort of outer cover, which more or less kept the damp off. I despise sleeping bags. I wouldn't use one for many years. I like to use blankets. There was a way of I learned that as a schoolboy how to fold your blankets. You had great big safety pins called blanket pins. You could pin them at so they didn't all come to pieces if you turned over, more or less. They stayed around you. They, you know, as a young man in Australia, I remember what one of the jokes men would tell, because of course there are lots of snakes in Australia, and the snakes would crawl into your blankets at night, if you know, to keep warm, and if you woke up in the morning and there was a snake beside you, you had to know what to do. Well, guess what? Well, for one thing, you must never close the end of your swag, you see. You must leave where your feet are open. And then if you've got a pal with you, you can get him to give you a lighted cigarette. And you can then puff the smoke down your blankets. And the snake will, with a bit of luck, don't like the smoke, so it'll crawl away from it, crawl out where your feet are. But if you haven't got a mate to give you a cigarette, well, you're in trouble, aren't you?
But then you came back to, was that your first farm in Bakewell?
I came back and I entered university to study agriculture. But I was already organic. Dad had acquainted me with, he'd got one or two friends who were beginning to think that way, and I'd drunk this in as when I was very young. Still at my first school, I think it must have been, probably when I was about 10 or even younger. And when I went to university, of course, the age of industrial business farming, instead of farming being a way of life, you see, as it used to be, it was becoming a business, how to make money out of it. And also chemicals were beginning to come in. And of course the university, being at the forefront of progress, tried to teach us these things, which I rebelled against from the beginning. So I didn't stay very long at university. After a couple of terms I left. And I've gone into life without any qualifications whatsoever. And while my friends all became sort of successful in the world of farming, particularly in employment in farming, you see, as I keep telling you, I've just remained at the bottom of the pile as a failure. Going my own stupid way.
Don't fence me in.
Don't fence me in.
And was that your method at your first farm when you were farming in Bakewell?
Well, do you know, one thing I soon after, of course it was Dad that bought the farm, but and it wasn't a farm really, it was only 3 little fields, for heaven's sake, just 3 little grass fields, about 10 acres in all. But of course I thought it was the world, and was quite madly proud of it. And I remember one day in early summer when the grass was growing thick and tall, ready to be cut for hay. There was a little lane going past the farm, and there was another young, well, a boy really, was walking through the hay crop. And of course that's a terrible thing to do if it's your grass, because if the grass gets trodden down, then the mowing machine gets bunged up, you see, it won't cut it properly. So you try to avoid doing that. And I got so cross with this little boy, I was swearing at him and in a shameful way. And his mother was standing on the lane, and she said, "Oh, you shouldn't talk to him like that." And I really felt so ashamed. And that was one of my first great lessons in the danger of possessiveness, you know, and the horrid way the dreadful way we can behave when we're just obsessed with my property and my rights. My rights to do things as I want, never mind anybody else. But we learn by hard lessons in life, don't we? That was one of mine.
We learn from our failures, not from our successes.
That's right, we do. And often it's very painful, because we hurt other people in the process, don't we?
Was it painful when you had to give up the first farm and go into the family business?
Yes, I injured my back when I was 21. I was put in a plaster straitjacket, and well, there was a family business which I'd never wanted to go into in the nearby town, but really I was crawling around on my hands and knees then. I couldn't really do much on the farm. So reluctantly I agreed to join the family business, and sat in an office and checked invoices for a few months. And then when the time came to remove this straitjacket, my back hurt more than ever. And I was in total despair, and the doctor advised me to give up farming at that point, which absolutely broke my heart, because I was absolutely dedicated to it. And then we were advised to go to a naturopath. I think they called her a naturopath. And I went to London to this big bonny woman, and she examined me and told me to lift up a chair. I said, "I can't." And she showed me how to do it as a child would, by squatting down on the ground and using my legs, keeping my back straight. And I could. And you know, that changed my life. She gave me hope, that woman. And I said, "I've been told I can't farm." And she said, "Of course you can." But I had backache, almost continuous backache throughout my farming years, but never mind, I was a farmer. To hell with backache. You can live with it, in and out of osteopaths.
I suppose the world of the office and business couldn't have been more like being fenced in.
Well, Dad did persuade me to go back in. Well, actually, we had a very good dad. He was very generous, and he wanted me to be a farmer, but he realised there was no money in farming, which of course there isn't, not the way I was doing it. And he says, "You have to learn to, farming's okay if you've got financial independence." That was his idea. So he felt I should go into business to make some money. So eventually I agreed to do that, but after a few years I couldn't bear it really. And I longed to be elsewhere. And at that time, the world was beginning to take notice of what was called the Third World then, and world poverty, and you know, there were pictures of little kids with their ribs showing and starving, which moved me very deeply. And I determined to go off to South America and do something about it, which I did, but it meant a severe severance from my father, who cut me off from my inheritance at that time, but I thought, to hell with the money. Of course, later on you learn more sense, don't you? But my young and foolish years, I thought I didn't need it. Anyway, off I went to South America, to my poor mother and father's despair, and learned a lot more hard lessons.
But at least you weren't fenced in South America.
No, my word, up on the high Andes, I had all the space in the world up there, and I loved it.
And did you learn as much from the indigenous farmers there as you did from perhaps the more modern techniques that you were trying to introduce?
Because they used bullocks, and the ploughing was done with wooden ploughs and bullocks, team of 2 bullocks, oxen. And there were lots of donkeys, carried everything everywhere. But they didn't have carts, didn't have wheels, because what use was a wheel on those steep mountain paths? Couldn't use them really, could you? So they didn't have wheels. Yes, everything was carried on donkeys. Or llamas, it's a bit lower down the slopes. Strings of llamas. So I loved that. I know a lot about working oxen. When I was in Australia, one of the great experiences of my life was to spend a few days with a bullock team up in what's called the Atherton Tableland, a jungle country at the far northeastern corner of Australia. Of course, everything's done by big machines and bulldozers now, but then there were still 1 or 2 teams of bullocks. He had 16 great bullocks all yoked together, and my word, it was one of the most wonderful sights I've ever seen, when those wonderful great animals were put their noses to the ground and heaved. My God, that picture is etched on my mind, one of the great sights. What a lot we've lost compared to a bulldozer.
I think you sketched some aspects of farming life in those years.
Yes, I did a bit. I write about it in my books. I kept, of course, not as much as I might have done, but as a young man I never thought too much of doing it, but enough to jog my memory. And yes, it's all mystic beginnings. There's a chapter on Australia, another one on South America, which I hope will be of interest to people.
You didn't need a team of 16 bullocks on your 3 acres in Bakewell, did you?
No, I didn't. I used my own muscles then. No. I had a horse on my first farm here in Bakewell, but when I went over to the fens, grew vegetables. Now I just had a wheelbarrow and a fork and spade.
But you worked the land by hand on your own in Lincolnshire, where Bicker is. Very, very flat, big skies, for many years, didn't you? Until...
Oh, that's a story. It'll take a week to tell that story. But again, it's written in my books, in Mystic Beginnings. Well, until a woman, of course. That's what changes our men's lives. Certainly changed mine.
The arrival of Shirley.
Well, she was the first woman, but oh my word, that's not always the end of the story, is it?
No, well, you were married, so there is a story. What's that sometimes quoted saying, usually by a best man at a wedding, marriage is an institution, and who wants to belong to an institution?
Well, they're all sorts of jokes made about it, but at the time it's dead serious, isn't it? And oh my word, what a lot there is to learn in life. We think we go to school to learn. School, hardly the beginning, is it? School of life. I'm still learning lessons every day now. Who isn't? I think the whole of life is really a school, and when we go out of this life, I think we just simply move into high school. I think this life is a preparatory school. And if we graduate, we may go on to high school. And it depends how we absorb the lessons of this life. Maybe, I don't really know. Who does?
Was marriage more of a freedom or a fencing in for you?
Oh, a fencing in. Very much so. But of course, there's another part of us, you see, that doesn't want to be free. There's another part of us longs for nothing more than a woman's arms around us, don't we? We want to be held and cuddled and loved, and for that we'll sell our freedom. A man will sell his soul for that, won't he? The right woman, that's why it's called the tender trap. Tender trap. Well, it isn't always tender, is it? It can be a bed of thorns. Women say yes, but they also say no, don't they? That's when the world comes tumbling down.
There's a very odd verse in Scripture that comes to mind. Do not be unequally yoked. I never quite got that.
I don't recall that, but it sounds biblical. Unequally yoked, but what does that mean? Who is one's equal? Socially speaking, emotionally, intellectually? There are many sides to it, aren't there?
In my young evangelical days, which is where I would have picked it up, I would take that to mean don't be yoked, don't have a non-Christian, an unchristian partner.
Even religion can be interpreted in many ways, can't it? I think my second marriage floundered very much on differing views of what was meant by service to God.
Which is a big surprise, really, as she was devoted to the Russian Orthodox practice, which was very familiar territory for you and dear to your heart.
Yes, it was indeed. Yes, to begin with, we were both devoted to it. Well, I still am. I've nothing but admiration for Russian Orthodoxy. Oh dear, life.
And transcendence, John. Of course, there is the spiritual dimension to Don't Fence Me In as well.
Well, yes, well, I discovered this. I learned to meditate. Well, actually, I was prompted to in that direction while I was in South America. And when I came back from there, I looked for someone to teach me to meditate. And I found a school in London. Only one school, mark you, because internet hadn't been invented and there wasn't this plethora of gurus that there is today, where you can pick any Tom, Dick or Harry or rather any Tom, Dick or Harry can set himself up as a spiritual teacher. Yes, in those days I only ever knew of this one school. I went there and they taught me. And my very first practice, it all opened up for me. And I realized I didn't have to travel the world to search for the wide open spaces I loved. They were all within me. Mind you, I have had many adventures since then in the wide open spaces of this world, but But that lesson has gone on expanding ever since. Yes, the real adventure is within. There's no question about that.
Yes, John, I remember you saying something that quite inspired me in one of our earlier videos, something along the lines of your God is too small. Push back the boundaries of your vision, of your seeing, because through the practice of meditation, there are no boundaries.
Yes, of course, the real fencing in is not the physical world. Well, we start from there when we're young, that's all we know. But then you realize that the real restriction of life is not outward, it's inward, it's in the mind. It's the thoughts, it's the conditioning that fence us in. And none more so than those of religion, or really any subject which is studied, first of all, within a structure. So the spiritual journey really consists of overcoming limits. It's not so much a matter of discovering anything new, but of letting go the limits of our thought, of our habitual thinking. For example, take the figure of Jesus. Well, here I speak in my own experience. My understanding of Jesus has gone on expanding to this day. We start off reading about a historical figure in time and space and words, but where does Jesus end? Indeed, we start off having a describable concept of what we call God. People talk confidently, do you believe in God? Have you found God? Well, I assure you, at my age, I wouldn't ever claim I found God. Who can find the infinite? Who can know God, really? Because, and interestingly enough, we're commanded not to know God, but to love Him. It is all the difference, isn't it? Knowledge, you see, is in itself a limitation. Human knowledge. The knowledge that we can describe or write about in a book. Anything we know, we put a little box around, don't we? We know this and we don't know that. So it's divisive, it's duality. True knowledge is really best, I like to describe it as, or higher knowledge is really faith. Faith isn't some sort of nebulous, woolly nothing. It's higher knowledge, but you can't describe it. You can't put it into words.
I think Paul calls it the substance of things not seen.
Yes, a very nice phrase, isn't it? Yeah. Yes, faith is in the invisible and the unheard, unseen, unheard.
Do you think, John, that words themselves fence us in?
Yes, they do. Yes, well, the moment you give a name to something, you see, you separate it from something else. You put a limit on it. Of course, this seems the right and admirable thing to do. You know, people, the early scientists started going around calling every butterfly, every flower by a different name, didn't they? and then putting it all in books and classifying it and all that, fencing it in from top to bottom. Mm-hmm. Yet who can fence beauty? Who can fence love? Who knows what it is? What is love? What is beauty? What is freedom? What is spirit? What is peace? We use these words every day and nobody knows what they are. Well, we know, but we cannot describe them, can we? And that is the nature of true knowledge, of faith. These eyes are spiritual blindness. What you can see with your physical eyes isn't it. And anything that dies, to have another definition, isn't it. Because death is the result of leaving our true home in spirit, where there are no limits, either of life or anything else. And the spiritual adventure is going from the world of limit to the unlimited. In the world of fences, to don't fence me in.
There are no fences in heaven then?
No, not one. And do you know where that is? It's all right here. In this, surrounded by massive stone walls and 1,000 years of history, there is this world of limit, of formalities of religion, of tradition. There is this unseen, unheard, but appreciable, is that a word? Can be appreciated? Presence, spiritual presence, the presence of God. And as we dwell, as we first of all appreciate, become acquainted with and dwell in that presence, then we gradually grow in spirit and grow out of the limits of what's called being a man. And in death, this happens naturally as we grow older, that the body falls away naturally, and we are released into this freedom of spirit. That's what death is all about. We move into high school, you see. The preparatory work has been done. The body can go to the grave. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. And the soul may ascend. Well, the soul, which isn't a matter of ascending or descending really, because it's all right here, isn't it? It really just appears as higher. But actually it's in everything, isn't it? This is the great lesson. How many adventures we go through in this life to eventually come home. So struggle on, my friends, many of whom are younger than I am. Fight the good fight, and may you find your home. God bless you all. Until another day.